It's another day of sun. Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. I am back today to do the wrap up of all of the books that I read in the month of May. I thought I'd quite like to try and do these videos a little bit earlier in the month than I did my last one. Of course, I started my channel quite late in the month, so I only did my April wrap up quite late in the month, but want to try and get into the habit of doing this much earlier. So starting off with a few books which I either have or will be doing slightly longer individual videos for. We have The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel. This is the final book in the Thomas Cromwell trilogy, and I believe that my video for this went up as the last video. I'm not quite sure. Hopefully it went up on Tuesday. So if you've seen that video, you will know that I absolutely loved this book. It is my favourite of the three. It has a much slower, more reflective pace, which is kind of evident in how big it is. It is a 900-page book, which is no mean feat. But yeah, I absolutely love this. I love this as a conclusion to that grand 2,000-page story. If you are at all interested in the Thomas Cromwell series and were maybe perhaps worried that she might not stick the landing, no worries here. This was a 5-star read for me. I absolutely loved it. I feel like I even had a little bit of a book hangover after reading that because I just thought, what am I going to read now? On the same theme, we have The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which I did a reading vlog for. This is the prequel to the Hunger Games series following the villain Coriolanus Snow from the original series. I thought this was really quite enjoyable. I know that some people have had issues with it, but personally for getting that little bit more backstory and a little bit of villain psychology, a little bit more insight into Panem before it came to be the world that we know it in the original series, I did quite enjoy it. I did have some issues which I went into in the reading vlog, but definitely have a look at that, make up your own mind. Personally, I would recommend giving it a check out, but I don't think it is the most necessary follow-up that we've ever had. And then the final book, which I will have more discussion on in a later video, is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I've got a discussion video coming up on this book, maybe the next video or the one after that, so I'm not going to say too much now. I actually read this back in April and then did a reread because I was still struggling to process my thoughts on this. What I will say is that I originally rated this a 3-star, but then on my reread in May, I rated it a 4-star. Ooh, intrigue, mystery. You'll have to see the discussion video to find out why. And now on to the rest of the books that I read in the month of May. I read The Five by Holly Rubenhold. This has been getting so much buzz and attention that it seems quite surprising to me that I hadn't picked it up until now. I think mainly the reason for that is that this isn't really my period of history. The Victorian era isn't quite my area, but I did want to see what all of the hype was about. This book really works to readdress how we talk about Jack the Ripper, and in particular, the women that he killed, putting the focus back onto the women themselves and their lives up until their murders, and trying to treat them as individuals rather than one of 5 women who were brutally killed. In this book, we get biographies of each of the 5 women, and it really paints a picture of what it was like to be a Victorian working class woman, the trials and tribulations, the level of opportunities, education, or lack of. This book has a really large focus on trying not to glamorize the murders in the way that Ripperology has been discussed in the past. It has often been, ooh, this mystery of who this man was, and oh, look how brutal and shocking these murders were. It really tries to strip away that and just focus on these women who have largely been ignored in history. Like I say, Victorian history is not quite my time period, so it wasn't a book that was an automatic 5 stars for me, but I think it is really important. I do recommend people read it, and I especially recommend it to get that history of what it was like to be a working class woman living in Victorian London. I think it's a very important read. Another piece of history non-fiction that I read this month was The Private Lives of the Tudors by Tracy Borman. As it says on the title, this has a chronological look at the Tudor monarchs and their private lives, their hygiene, their rituals, the food they ate, the clothes they wore, their sex lives in particular, and how really their private lives were not very private at all. You know, the Tudor monarchs were constantly surrounded by people. That it's always shocking to me that anybody ever managed to have an affair during the Tudor period. People were constantly at your beck and call, sleeping by your feet. However, the Tudors did have this very strong sense of trying to keep private and public very separate, and this is the main argument that Tracy Borman has for the Tudors, is that the reason that they were able to be so successful. I don't know, they only survived 3 generations, but in many ways they were successful at keeping a bit of mystique around the monarchy in a way that their successors were not able to do. Their successors, particularly James I, really muddied that line between private and public, and that it is for that reason that the monarchy started to be looked at in a much more negative light in the Stuart period. I thought this was a really enjoyable read, as this is my time period, this is what I love to read about. I think if you are new to the Tudor time period, then I don't think there is anything in here that will be too inaccessible. I think it is very entertainingly written. However, perhaps if you are very, very well versed in Tudor history, this isn't going to blow you away. It's not going to have any big shocking revelations that you didn't know about before. But an entertaining read nonetheless, and I would say I'd rate this about 4 stars. Once again, with lockdown, I was able to indulge in my favourite thing, which is to watch the free productions of William Shakespeare's plays that were being put up on YouTube whilst reading them at the same time. I'm getting into a fun little habit of like pausing, reading a bit, then pressing play, watching a bit, then just doing that through the entire production. I love doing it so much, and this month I got to read Antony and Cleopatra and The Two Noble Kinsmen, which were both plays that I had personally never read or seen before, so it was really, really great to be able to get that opportunity to see such great productions. Antony and Cleopatra really is Shakespeare doing what Shakespeare does best, and just talking about human nature and human emotion, commenting on how ridiculous humans are. I'd always kind of perceived Antony and Cleopatra as being a romantic play, but actually was quite shocked when reading and watching it to see that I don't really think that's the case at all. I think it's kind of similar to how a lot of people initially view Romeo and Juliet. They see that as being a very romantic play, and then you watch it and you're like, oh no, this is just about how ridiculous people are. Something I hadn't expected was the fact that Shakespeare begins this play very much towards the end of the relationship with Antony and Cleopatra. We therefore don't get to see like the big romantic build-up. We see the reaction and the consequences, but I don't think we really sit very long in the romance. The main theme in this play is about how reason and emotion can conflict with each other and lead to devastating consequences. It was a really great play to read and to watch, and I really recommend this one. The Two Noble Kinsmen was quite interesting. This is a play that was co-written by both Shakespeare and John Fletcher, and I feel like you can kind of tell that there are 2 authors in this work. It does feel a little bit mixed at times. It definitely has its funny moments, and I would be interested in looking more at this, seeing other productions of this play. Though I think a lot of my main issues with it were plot-based, you know, the direction of where the story went, rather than the writing, so that's quite good. I think it has some really interesting, funny characters, especially the 2 noble kinsmen themselves, Palamon and Arcite. They were very, very funny to watch. The way that their dynamic shifts from being like best friends to suddenly hating each other and being bitter rivals as soon as they see a pretty woman in their life. I also thought the character of Amelia was really interesting, and I wanted to see even more from her. So yeah, for me, quite a middling Shakespeare play. I think the bits that were really good and strong and funny were fantastically funny, and the bits that kind of dragged really did drag, but still very entertaining, still gave me quite a lot to think about. And finally, I have 2 historical fiction novels that I read in May. We first have The Good People by Hannah Kent. This is set in Ireland in the early 19th century in a very rural little village. This follows the story of a lady called Nora whose husband has recently died. And in the middle of suffering from her bereavement, she is also having to take care of her 4-year-old grandson who has recently lost the ability to talk and walk. Nora has been hiding her grandson from the villagers outside for fear of judgment. She hires a young girl called Mary from a nearby town to come and help her look after the child, and then they start consulting with a mysterious old woman called Nance Roach. Nance Roach claims that she consults with the good people, kind of spirits in the forest, and they start to believe that perhaps the 4-year-old has been possessed, and that they too need to consult the help of these good people to get the 4-year-old back to normal. This was quite an interesting one for me. I think it's very clear how much research Hannah Kent put into this world. It is very, very atmospheric. However, sometimes it did feel like she was falling into the trap of trying to show too much of her research on the page, you know, putting too many little details in, then actually felt natural. It dealt with very interesting themes of the clash between modernity and old folklore and tradition, but I did for me feel like it was quite a slow read, and it only really started to pick up in the last 100 or so pages. I think a 3-star read, though, did have some interesting commentary, and like I say, those last 100 pages were very engaging. And then last was Bone China by Laura Purcell. So we start this story following a character called Hester Y, who has recently arrived at Morvern House, this very gothic, mysterious house in Cornwall, and she has been engaged to look after and be the maid to Louise Pinecroft. Louise Pinecroft is now very elderly, she can no longer talk, and she spends all of her days staring at her collection of bone china, and that is all she does all day. The house is eerie and mysterious, and the staff are quite odd, and we are slowly through the story unraveling what has happened in the past. This book juggles 3 different timelines. We have the present day narrative of Hester and Louise. We also learn about Hester's backstory and how she came to Cornwall from her original job in London. We also see Louise 40 years ago and how she came to be in her state. And therein lay quite a few issues for me because we were following 3 different timelines, and I didn't feel like any of them really linked very well together or were very compelling on their own. The story started to feel quite convoluted. It sometimes felt like the first half of the novel didn't match at all with the second half, and the present day narrative wasn't strong or compelling enough on its own, that when you're going backwards and forwards through these time periods, it's just a little bit confusing and a bit of a mess, and like there were too many plates trying to be spun. This was also the 3rd historical fiction novel that I read in a row which used this trope of the witchy wise woman. This uses it, The Good People uses it, and so does Hamnet, and it's a trope that I don't really like, and I do go into in my Hamnet review. But I didn't really love the use of it here either. I feel like The Good People and Hamnet used it in interesting ways to make interesting commentary, but I really didn't like it in here. I think seeing this kind of witchy woman trope in so many historical fiction novels back to back has really demonstrated to me is the fact that we have so little evidence for working class women's lives through history. Typically, the only time in a lot of historical record that we tend to see the lives of working class women being represented is when they transgress. And a very common depiction of a deviant woman, so to speak, in history is the witch. And therefore, in a lot of historical fiction, women tend to either be portrayed as being one of a homogenous group of women who are all obeying by strict social norms, or they are the deviant, the witch. And yeah, it's something we really need to work on and really need to dig deep to try and not portray women in this very homogenous kind of way in the future. But it's really hard to do that when there is such a lack of evidence. I don't know, it's an interesting one. It's one that I've been thinking about a lot this month. So yeah, I didn't really enjoy this, unfortunately, and I feel like the only contribution to the conversation about this book that I can really have is trying to point out to people that this is not set in the Victorian era, this is set in Napoleonic era. I just feel like I've seen so many people talking about how this is a Victorian Gothic novel, and it's not. Pernickety history student strikes again. So yes, that was everything that I read in the month of May. A little bit of an up and down reading month for me, but I think the things that were really good were super strong and some of my favourite books of the year. I will leave the links to all of the longer form reviews that I have done for any of these books, and I hope you do enjoy those too. I hope that you're having a fantastic, fantastic day and look forward to speaking to you soon. Thanks, bye.